Swadhin, and this is my first time meeting Nadine, and what a nice way to meet. Thank you for putting this together. And 10 minutes is a new format for me. I am, I guess, a professional public speaker at this point, but really I think of myself as an organizer and a collective healer around the issue of sexual violence and ending rape culture, and very specifically around ending childhood rape and sexual assault. So I have spent the last 3 years traveling the country, interviewing specifically LGBT people of color who were raped as children in the United States, and I've recorded 60 interviews across 15 different states, and had the great honor of representing the Democratic Party and specifically LGBT people and survivors of sexual violence at Jeff Sessions' confirmation hearing when he was up for Attorney General. So it's nice to be home in Los Angeles, and I will just say that I've gotten very spoiled around having an hour to tell you everything about how I got to where I do, and I love the challenge of I'm ready. All right, we have 10 minutes together. Let me make this as impactful as possible. Tarana is a colleague of mine, Tarana Burke, who founded Me Too. We are in this fellowship space of people of color who are working to end sexual violence through our own experiences as survivors. And it's been amazing to watch all of the work that she's been able to do and the way she's been able to move the conversation through the media and through just the alchemy, right? The magic of Alyssa Milano tweeting at the right time with this phrase. And at the same time, I'm really cognizant that even in this era of Me Too and so much disclosure and so much talking about sexual violence, we're still actually not talking about children being raped and sexually assaulted. So I'm trying to do justice to why I do what I do. So I am a survivor of childhood rape. To your point, Stacey, around those horrible stories, that is also my story. I was raped by my father for most of my childhood, starting at the age of 4 until I was 12. And then I went through the criminal legal system, not by choice, but by mandated reporting when I was 13. And it was a really terrible experience because of racism and because of the way that the state works and who the state was founded for in the United States and how that works. I grew up in northern New Jersey, right outside New York City. My parents are immigrants from India. And when I was growing up in New Jersey, it was part of the large wave of Indian immigration through New York City and into the suburbs. And of course, whenever there's a wave of immigration, we see that now, right? There's always a backlash by people who are aligned with white supremacy. So certainly that's not everyone, but they are everywhere. And so that was really populating the culture, I think, of how social workers and prosecutors and police officers responded in my life. And so without really having all of that language at the age of 13, I got politicized without knowing that I was being politicized. I just had the feeling that this was not right, this was not the help that I actually needed, and I knew that I wanted to heal, but I didn't really know what that looked like. So if we can move to the next slide. This is what society prescribes for survivors who are trying to heal, right? That we should report to the police or to a social worker, we should prosecute, we should send the person who raped us to jail, and then we should pursue therapy one-on-one. And I just want to say emphatically, as someone who's been raped over 400 times in my life, if I only did this, I do not think that I would be in a place at all where I felt healed. And let's talk about why. So that would be the next slide. There's this thing that we're all living within called rape culture, right? I travel the country and hear so many people in this era of Me Too talking about survivors and non-survivors, and specifically survivors, perpetrators, and bystanders, as if we're 3 separate categories, right? But that's actually not real. The thing is, like, whether you're a survivor or not, you were raised in rape culture. Every single person in the world, unfortunately, rape culture is a global phenomenon. It looks different in different countries, right? My family being from India originally, how rape culture works in India is different because the people who have power in Indian society are a different group of people than the people who have power in the United States, right? In India, it's like Hindu Brahmins, if you know anything about the caste system, are the ones with power. And people who are not Hindu Brahmin are oppressed in the laws and the culture and the politics of that country. And so there is like social sanctioning for Brahmin men specifically to commit sexual violence generationally against Dalit women, sometimes called untouchable women, right? Those are the women who are considered less than as human beings. So we see a parallel phenomenon in the United States because of the way this country was founded, right? That we know this country was founded by white, landed, wealthy, cisgender, straight, well, maybe they were not straight, we don't really know. We should assume that they were at least believers in the institution of marriage and what it did for their property, right? Men. And then they set up everything. Every law that we're living under, every political party system, certainly all the culture that has evolved, I don't know, maybe devolved from that place, was set up with their interests and only their interests in mind. And so what that means is, in a country that was colonized, right, who was considered non-human in that moment of this country's founding? And for a long time after, we might even argue still the remnants of that today, right? We've never had reparations in this country for the genocide of indigenous people. We've never had reparations in this country for the enslavement of people from Africa. And we know there's so much documentation of this in like really nerdy subpoints, right? You kind of have to search for it, or you just have to turn your mind on to think about the fact that Native children were stolen from reservations and put into boarding schools. And then we know actually that they were systematically raped by the nuns and the priests most of the time who were running those schools. It's very well documented. It's just not talked about, at least not in mainstream society. Not even in this moment of Me Too, right? We know that when people were stolen from Africa and forced into slavery here, rape was a part of slavery. It was a systematic part of what happened to people who were enslaved. Children were raped, men were raped, women were raped. There was no such thing as consent, right? Because of what it meant to be a slave, you were considered somebody's property. So, you know, roughly 200-something years later, when I say rape culture, I'm talking about a culture that comes from that very specific history, right? And so we all know what happened to Dr. Ford, right? When she stood up in front of that Senate Judiciary Committee and she told her truth, and she wasn't taken seriously, right? She was mocked by our president at a rally. I mean, to say that that was triggering, like as a survivor, I know I'm talking to other survivors always, everywhere I go, because there's so many of us, right? That is rape culture. But we also know that that same Senate Judiciary Committee, a lot of the same men, like Chairman Grassley, for example, was on the Senate Judiciary Committee when Anita Hill testified years earlier against Clarence Thomas, who's of course now a Supreme Court Justice. And I think it gets tricky when we think about these divisions between bystanders and perpetrators and survivors, who's a good person and who's not, because like, I'm going to talk a little bit in a few minutes about the Violence Against Women Act, but the Violence Against Women Act, very important piece of legislation, founded in 1994 because a senator had the courage to put it forward, and then he became vice president later. That's Vice President Biden. What people don't remember is that he was the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee when Anita Hill testified against Clarence Thomas. Right? So he founded or started or sponsored, I think the word is, sponsored the Violence Against Women Act in the wake of his great failure to be an ally to a survivor of sexual assault, right? And now we see him as a champion because we largely have collective amnesia. I'm not trying to say that he's a bad person. I'm just trying to complicate and trouble the narrative, right? Of who gets to be the good guy? Who's the bad guy? When the entire culture is steeped in a lack of consent. When all of our institutions are founded on this violence, right? And so for me, when I think about my own individual healing, I don't think it would have been enough for me to just go to therapy privately, because I grew up to be a non-white woman who is also queer, who's partnered with a transgender person. The people in my community are considered non-human or subhuman, right? My partner's a black transgender man. He gets hunted by the police in Los Angeles, pulled over with guns drawn at least every other month, right? That's the reality of black people in general, especially black masculine people in the United States. And then to be transgender on top of it, we have a president who literally released a memo through the Health and Human Services Department just a couple of weeks ago, asserting that transgender is not a real identity, right? That has huge implications for people around medical care, around accessing social services, around getting respected in jobs, around having your civil rights protected, respected, right? This is, to me, all part of rape culture. I don't think we can separate these things. So how does that, what is that prescription then for someone like me in my healing? So if we can go forward. I want to talk a little bit about the fact that there's no such thing as like a flat survivor identity. We don't all experience rape culture at the same rate. Let's talk about children specifically, because that's the work that I do. Children with disabilities are disproportionately sexually assaulted and raped in childhood. 68% of girls with disabilities and 30% of boys with disabilities will experience sexual violence before the age of 18. Next slide, please. When we talk about gender identity, I think in the Me Too era, we're almost always talking about a unidirectional arrow of harm from cisgender men towards cisgender women and girls. But when you center children, the whole picture gets a lot more complicated, right? Because we know that children who are assigned male at birth are also sexually assaulted. The CDC statistic, by the way, for all people is 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys will be sexually assaulted or raped by the age of 18. So that's 20% of the American population. But within that, transgender people, or people who are gender nonconforming, 1 in 2, almost, 47% will experience a form of sexual violence at some point in their lifetime. It's an incredibly high rate. And that's because of transphobia, right? Transphobia makes them vulnerable to violence from people. In terms of race, Native women, and again, going back to the founding of this country, right, 34% of Native women will be raped at some point in their lifetime. And to me, again, this is where some of my anger goes in a productive way, right? Thinking about what's wrong with our system and what we can fix collectively. I really believe that if a system is created, it can be undone, it can be remade. So the U.S. Attorney's Office, that's the USAO, 67% of the cases of sexual abuse that Native women brought forth to prosecute were declined by the U.S. Attorney's Office. Next slide, please. So what does my healing look like? And what does my prescription for healing look like? I think it's 3 things: solidarity, storytelling, and advocacy. So I live with complex post-traumatic stress disorder. I've had it since I was a kid. I got diagnosed when I was in college. PTSD is a mental health quote-unquote disorder, or a state of being that stems from neurobiological injury. And what happens to your neurobiological system, and you were talking about this, Rachel, and I was like, I have the data, or maybe it was you, yeah, it was like, so much of this resonates with me because it's actually, there are scientific explanations for what happens to us when we get raped or sexually assaulted. And for people like myself, where it happens over and over and over, your limbic system gets flooded. Your adrenal system gets blown out, right? And so you're absolutely right, Stacy, that you have to do energy healing. I use a lot of plant medicine, things like ayahuasca, things like psilocybin, to heal on a completely different level. But even if I healed myself 100%, which I think I'm pretty close to at this point, it's been 25 years of conscious healing, I'm still living in a society and a structure that is trying to attack me and my community every single day. Right? So to me, there's a prescription for social change, collective change. I can't actually make the world safe for myself alone. I need to do it with people. So PTSD happens, and when I get re-triggered, it's because I still feel powerless in the face of violence, right? I may have healed from the violence of my father, but the violence of the world against me and the people that I share my life with is ongoing. And so solidarity for me has been an incredibly important practice. And to me, what that means is a practice where I'm decentering my own trauma as the focal point and looking at the places where I hold privilege. Because actually all of us, unless you live in the intersection of every single form of oppression you can imagine, we all have some privilege even when we've been incredibly hurt. So for me, I have a very elite education. I went to Georgetown, to the School of Foreign Service, and then I went to NYU. So I have access to a seat at a table that a lot of my community members don't. I'm not a black person. I'm an American-born child of immigrants from India. That's incredibly important, right? Because I can sort of see American politics from a non-white perspective, but then I'm often given a seat at the table because of anti-blackness in a way that my black comrades often aren't. So how can I practice solidarity and talk about the struggle of unmet reparations in this country, for example, every time I have a microphone, right? And that helps me feel like I can do something that is building a bridge to people who are disempowered in a way that I'm not, right? And we know that what that triggers is the healing power of altruism. There's been a lot written, you all know, in the world of social entrepreneurship, that when we give and when we do something good for another person, it actually feels good for us. I experience that in the work that I do because my work centers transgender people of color. And although I'm queer, I'm not transgender, right? So it's an experience outside of myself that also helps me heal by doing work in solidarity in relationship to people in that community. And we also know that when we're raped or sexually assaulted, we experience isolation. We experience the breaking of intimacy. So to me, healing is also about connection. It's also about fostering threads that break isolation, right? Next slide, please. I promise, Nadine's like, you're going over. I'm like, I'm finishing, I promise. From a neurobiological perspective, there's a lot to say about storytelling and what that can do. I agree that talk therapy is not enough, but I think when you actually activate mirror neurons, is a thing in your brain, when the listener is ready to be empathetic and receive your story, and especially when the listener looks like you in whatever way, has experienced some social category that you also belong to, and you know that ahead of time, it actually provides a healing experience for both parties. So this is sort of the basis of Mirror Memoirs, where I'm a queer person of color who was raped as a child, and I'm traveling the country holding space for other LGBT people of color who were raped as children. So healing experience for both of us. Oftentimes people in that community have not experienced therapy, either because they can't afford it, or because there aren't enough therapists who are culturally competent. Right? And so this becomes a healing experience outside of the traditional model of therapy that's actually still doing something to heal our brains. Next slide, please. So this was the first Mirror Memoirs national convening that we had. There's about 200 people in our base at this point, either people who have shared their story on recordings or have reached out to me to say, I want to share my story. And so we gathered together. There were 31 of us at the first gathering. Not everyone wanted to be in the picture, but everybody here actually consented to have their picture shared on slides touring this way. And this was at the end of 2 days of nonstop talking about and practicing somatic healing practices and doing policy advocacy, envisioning about childhood rape, sexual assault, racism, and transphobia. So I think this is really telling, because you might expect like doom and gloom faces, but we're all really happy, right? There's just something really powerful about this kind of healing, where we're not just healing ourselves, we're actually saying, what can we do to push back and change the world that we live in, and how can we do it together? Next slide. So what can we all do together? I mentioned the Violence Against Women Act, and it was passed in 1994. It's been a very successful, generally bipartisan piece of legislation that has been one of the largest funding sources for rape crisis shelters, domestic violence shelters, and also legal aid societies that help survivors of domestic and sexual violence. In 2013, it was actually expanded to specifically protect undocumented immigrants, Native women, and LGBTQ individuals who had not been protected by earlier versions of the bill. And for the first time in 2013, there were senators who voted against that bill. All 22 of the senators who voted against it in 2013 were Republicans. No surprise, most of them are on the Senate Judiciary Committee. So the same Senate Judiciary Committee that Dr. Ford had to testify in front of, that I had to testify in front of. Senator Sessions, now former Attorney General Sessions, also was one of those 22 people who voted no. So to me, that's like a show of what extreme bigotry is in that very right-wing arm of the Republican Party that has hijacked the Republican Party, right? That they hate LGBT people and undocumented immigrants so much that they would rather take away the Violence Against Women Act entirely, right? This year, earlier in 2018, Representative Sheila Jackson-Lee from Texas sponsored a new version of the Violence Against Women Act that would also take weapons away from domestic abusers and increase funding even more for rape crisis shelters, but none of the 173 co-sponsors are Republican. So the bill has just been sitting and languishing in Congress. It has not been passed. And so currently, the Violence Against Women Act is set to expire on December 7th. So a lot of people don't know about this, right? I think we are so put into a place by our collective perpetrator, which is how I think about him, as our president, right? We're all being manipulated by his Twitter feed to look somewhere else and to not think about it and to be reactive to his politic. And I think it's time for us, you know, especially as survivor activists and becoming active in our own collective healing, to be proactive. And if we really want to be proactive and do something collectively, I think this is a great place and an easy place for us to start, especially with this new version of Congress. So that's my prescription for all of us. Thank you so much. You can actually contact your congressperson, both your senator and your representative in the House, and make sure that they know it's important to get Representative Lee's bill back on the floor so that it can go for a vote. There hasn't been much action on it. Thank you for the question. Thank you for the time. That's me. If you want to watch the testimony, you can Google it. It's on C-SPAN. But this is a little bit about the work of Memoirs. We're doing trainings and healing circles, and most of us are based in Southern California. So love to connect with all of you and bring us out to your organizations.